In the shadow of towering peaks, where only the wind remembers old prayers, stands a crumbling stone church. This is where they found each other. A boy with no family and a dog with no home. "No one wanted me," says Marcus, his eyes reflecting the mountain light. "But these mountains became my parents, and Rusty became my brother. What began as shelter from bitter winters transformed into something miraculous. With salvaged materials and untrained hands, the abandoned child and his loyal companion turned broken pews into gardens, shattered windows into prisms of light, and cold stone floors into a home filled with warmth. But how did a forgotten child survive alone in the harsh wilderness? What drove him to rebuild rather than destroy? And how did this broken place become a sanctuary that now draws visitors from across the country who call it the Mountain Miracle? The memory of that day was etched into Marcus's mind, like the harsh lines carved by wind and water into the mountains themselves. He was 7 years old, wearing his favorite blue sweater that was already too small for his growing frame, clutching a small backpack containing a change of clothes, a worn teddy bear missing one eye, and a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, standing beside the rusted signpost where the dirt road from the valley met the trail that wound its way up toward the scattered homes of Pinecrest Village. His mother's final words still echoing in his ears. "Wait, right here. Marcus, Daddy and I need to take care of something important. We'll be back before dark." But as the crisp mountain air carried away her promise, something in her voice had trembled. Something in the way she couldn't meet his eyes when she kissed his forehead had planted a seed of doubt that grew with every passing hour. A doubt that transformed into cold certainty as the afternoon shadows stretched longer across the alpine meadow, and the golden light of day surrendered to the purple dusk of evening. And still, no sign of the familiar rumble of their old station wagon returning along the valley road. He had waited with the patient trust that only children possess, amusing himself by collecting pine cones, arranging them in patterns, counting the cars that passed only 3, none of them stopping despite his hopeful wave, watching eagles circle high above, and trying not to think about the growing emptiness in his stomach, or the way the mountain air grew sharp with cold as the sun began its descent. Until finally, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the truth settled over him like the evening chill. Well, they weren't coming back. Yet even then, he couldn't bring himself to leave the spot, as if moving would somehow break the last thread connecting him to his parents. So instead, he huddled against the signpost, wrapping his arms around his knees, making himself as small as possible against the growing darkness and the unimaginable realization that he had been left behind, abandoned in this remote place where the mountains rose like indifferent giants around him, their ancient peaks watching dispassionately as a child's world collapsed beneath them. It wasn't until the howl of a distant coyote pierced the night that fear finally overcame his desperate hope, sending him stumbling toward the lights of the village that twinkled like fallen stars half a mile up the winding path, his small feet carrying him forward while his heart remained at the signpost, waiting for headlights that would never appear, and for parents who had made the impossible calculation that a child was a burden they could no longer bear. He didn't understand then what he would learn years later: that poverty and desperation can break even the strongest bonds, that his parents had been drowning in debt, that his mother had been sick with no money for treatment, that they had convinced themselves he might have a better chance if taken in by the kind mountain folk than dragged down by their inevitable collapse. All he understood in that moment was the primal, devastating knowledge that the two people who were supposed to love him most in the world had driven away and left him behind, and as the night engulfed the little boy making his way up the mountain path, the vast indifference of the universe was momentarily broken by the sound of a child's sobs, carried away by the wind that whispered through the pines with ancient wisdom that someday, somehow, this abandonment would be just the first chapter in a story of remarkable resilience. The mountain village of Pinecrest sat perched like a fragile nest on the sloping mountainside, its scattered homes, with their warm yellow windows, offering an illusion of sanctuary that dissolved into nothing. As Marcus approached, his small bee, Odie, trembling with cold and fear, for though he could see the houses, he couldn't bring himself to knock on a stranger's door, to explain what had happened when he himself didn't understand. So instead, he slipped between buildings like a shadow, his eyes darting for somewhere, anywhere, to shelter from the night that pressed down with increasing weight upon his narrow shoulders. He found it at the edge of the village, a small garden shed behind what appeared to be a vacant summer cabin, its door secured with a simple latch that yielded to his desperate tugging, revealing a space no bigger than a closet, filled with the sharp smell of lawn fertilizer, old gasoline, and the earthen scent of terracotta pots stacked in one corner, but it offered walls against the wind and a roof against the vast, indifferent sky that had watched his abandonment with cold, twinkling eyes. He crawled inside, pulling the door closed behind him, and in the perfect darkness, he finally allowed his body to collapse, the small backpack serving as a meager pillow beneath his head, while the hard wooden floor pressed against his side with unyielding reality. Hunger gnawed at him like a living thing, for the single sandwich had been consumed hours ago while waiting at the signpost, and now his stomach contracted with hollow pain that harmonized with the deeper, more profound emptiness spreading through his chest. In the protective dark, where no one could see, Marcus finally surrendered to the tears he'd been fighting, his small body convulsing with sobs that seemed to rise from the very center of his tears flowing hot against his cold cheeks as he gasped and hiccuped and curled tighter into himself, trying to make himself as small as his feelings, wondering what terrible thing he must have done to deserve this fate. Was it the broken window last month when he'd played baseball in the yard after being told not to? Was it the bad grades on his spelling tests? Was it the way he sometimes talked back to his mother when she was having one of her tired days? Was it simply that he wasn't good enough, wasn't lovable enough, wasn't worth keeping? These thoughts circled like predators in his mind, as his tears gradually subsided into the occasional hiccuping gasp. His body exhausted beyond its small capacity to process grief. Outside, the mountain night had fully descended, bringing with it sounds that had never seemed threatening before, but now pressed against the thin wooden walls with menacing potential, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in underbrush, the creak and groan of trees bending in the high-altitude wind, and the occasional scrape of branches against the shed roof that made his heart leap into his throat. Through the cracks in the shed walls, moonlight eventually filtered in, casting silver lines across the floor that seemed to Marcus like the bars of a cage, trapping him in a reality he couldn't escape. And though exhaustion eventually dragged him toward unconsciousness, his sleep was fitful and haunted by dreams where he ran along endless mountain roads, chasing the taillights of his parents' car that always remained just beyond his reach, until finally, in the coldest hours before dawn, he fell into the merciful oblivion of deep sleep, his tears dried on his cheeks and his small hand still clutching the one-eyed teddy bear, the last connection to a life that had vanished like morning mist in the mountain Sunday. Morning arrived with cruel brightness, the sun illuminating Marcus's desperate situation as he crept from the shed, stomach cramping with hunger, eyes puffy from crying through the night. He needed food, and the realization that no one would provide it but himself settled over him with newfound clarity that pushed aside some of his grief, replacing it with the immediate urgency of survival. Avoiding the main paths of the village, Marcus foraged at its edges, finding a wild apple tree with several fallen fruits, some bruised but edible, and a raspberry bush whose late-season berries offered tart sustenance. He gathered these treasures in the front of his shirt, forming a makeshift pouch, and was considering where to enjoy his meager breakfast when a low whimper from beneath a nearby spruce caught his attention. Cautiously approaching, Marcus discovered what appeared to be a bundle of matted, copper-colored fur, which revealed itself to be a medium-sized dog, its ribs showing through its coat, one back leg badly cut and swollen. The dog raised its head weakly at Marcus's approach, amber eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, too weak to flee or fight. "I won't hurt you," Marcus whispered, his voice scratchy from crying, as he slowly lowered himself to a crouch several feet away, carefully placing one of his apples on the ground between them, then backing away to give the animal space. The dog eyed the offering suspiciously before hunger overcame caution, and it dragged itself forward to sniff the fruit. The dog looked up at Marcus questioningly, as if asking permission, and when the boy nodded encouragingly, it took a tentative bite, then devoured the apple with desperate speed that Marcus recognized from his own hollow emptiness. Without hesitation, Marcus placed another apple and a handful of berries before the animal, watching with strange satisfaction as the dog consumed what represented half of his day's findings. "I'm Marcus," he said softly, not feeling foolish at all for introducing himself to a dog, because in that moment this injured animal was the only living being who seemed to notice his existence. The dog finished eating and, with obvious pain, managed to shift a few inches closer to the boy, offering a single hesitant lick to Marcus's outstretched hand. "You need a name," Marcus decided, studying the rusty copper color of the dog's coat catching the morning sunlight. "I'll call you Rusty." And something about giving the dog a name made Marcus feel less alone in the vast indifference of the mountains. With gentle, patient movements, he inched closer until he could examine the injured leg, finding a deep gash likely caused by a trap or sharp metal, crusted with dirt and beginning to show signs of infection. Two abandoned souls had found each other in their moment of greatest need, and as Marcus carefully gathered Rusty into his arms, surprised at how light the medium-sized dog was, he felt for the first time since watching his parents drive away that he had a purpose beyond his own survival. For 3 days, Marcus and Rusty had survived in a precarious routine, sleeping in the garden shed, Marcus scavenging for food by day while cleaning Rusty's wound with water from a mountain stream, the boy and dog finding in each other's company a small comfort against the vast loneliness. But Marcus knew they couldn't stay much longer. Having already spotted the cabin's owners arriving to close it up for the season, and with the first frost crystallizing the grass each morning, he understood that mountain winter would soon descend with merciless force. Rusty's leg was healing, though he still limped heavily, and Marcus had fashioned a crude leash from a piece of clothesline he'd found behind the village laundromat, allowing the dog to hobble alongside him as they ventured further up the mountainside, away from the village and deeper into the wilderness, where the boy hoped to find a cave or some natural shelter that might protect them through the coming cold. The higher they climbed, the more rugged the terrain became, with pine forests giving way to rocky outcroppings and meadows turned golden with autumn, the path narrowing until it was little more than a deer trail winding between granite boulders. Rusty suddenly stopped, his nose lifting to the wind, ears perked forward with interest rather than alarm, and without warning, the dog tugged Marcus off the path, limping determinedly through a thicket of overgrown bushes that scratched at the boy's face and arms. "Rusty, wait," Marcus called, but the dog pressed on until they emerged into a small clearing where the boy stopped in wonderment, for before them stood a structure that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself, a stone church, its gray walls blending with the surrounding rocky landscape, partially reclaimed by nature, with vines creeping up its sides and wildflowers sprouting between the stones of its cracked foundation. Time and the elements had not been kind to the building. Part of the roof had collapsed, one wall had crumbled entirely, and most of the windows were empty of glass, like eye sockets in an ancient skull, yet there remained enough intact structure to suggest shelter, a solid stone wall facing the direction of prevailing winds, a portion of roof still sturdy over what must have been the sanctuary, and a bell tower that reached skyward like a finger pointing to heaven. Rusty padded forward confidently, as if he'd known of this place all along, disappearing through the arched doorway that stood open to the elements, its wooden doors long since rotted away. Marcus followed more cautiously, stepping into a space where sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and falling in golden patches across stone floors, partially covered with leaves and debris. Despite its state of disrepair, the church retained an undeniable presence, sense of sanctuary that resonated with the abandoned boy, and as Rusty settled himself in a patch of sunlight near what remained of the altar, Marcus ran his hand along a stone wall, feeling the solid permanence beneath his fingers and thinking that perhaps here, in this forgotten place where the mountains had reclaimed what humans had abandoned, he and Rusty might find a home. The abandoned church became their refuge, but survival required more than shelter, and Marcus quickly realized that his knowledge of the mountain's offerings was dangerously limited. Necessity proved a harsh but effective teacher as he ventured out each day, observing which berries birds ate and which they avoided, gradually compiling a mental catalog of safe foods, EST, the tartness of wild blueberries, the earthy sweetness of alpine strawberries, and the nutty satisfaction of pine nuts painstakingly extracted from cones. Through trial and error, Marcus fashioned simple snares from twine he'd taken from the village, setting them along game trails. Rusty helped him identify, his heart simultaneously leaping with success and sinking with remorse, the first time he found a rabbit caught in his trap. Hunger quickly overcame his hesitation as he learned to clean and cook the small animals over fires built in the stone fireplace that remained intact in one corner of the church, the ancient chimney still drawing smoke skyward as it had for generations of mountain worshippers. Rusty's leg healed completely, revealing him to be not just a companion, but a partner in survival. The dog's keen senses alerted Marcus to approaching hikers long before the boy could hear them, giving him time to hide their presence, while Rusty's hunting instincts proved invaluable as he flushed grouse from underbrush or tracked wounded rabbits that escaped Marcus's inexpert traps. Water presented its own challenge, solved partially by positioning buckets and pots scavenged from the village dump to catch rainfall through the broken roof. Supplemented by regular trips to a spring, Rusty discovered half a mile from their sanctuary, where crystal-clear water bubbled from between rocks with reliable abundance. The first snowfall arrived earlier than Marcus had anticipated, covering their mountain world in pristine white that stole his breath with its beauty, even as it filled him with dread. He spent days gathering and stockpiling firewood, dragging fallen branches through the snow until his hands were raw and his muscles ached, understanding that warmth would be as essential as food in the months ahead. By the time the deep cold of winter settled over the mountains, Marcus had transformed a corner of the church into a surprisingly cozy den. Friend pine boughs covered with scavenged blankets created a soft sleeping area, stored firewood lined the intact walls, and dried meat and foraged nuts hung in bundles from the remaining rafters. Each night, as temperatures plummeted and wind howled through the broken windows, Marcus would curl against Rusty's warm fur, his hand buried in the dog's thick winter coat, and though his stomach often growled with persistent hunger and his body ached from constant work, there was a growing pride in having survived another day through his own efforts and the loyal partnership of the dog who had become his family. Winter descended upon the mountains with merciless intensity, transforming their world into a realm of ice and shadow, where survival became a daily battle against nature's indifference. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, snow piled in drifts taller than Marcus himself, and winds howled through the church's broken windows with such ferocity that no amount of scavenged blankets seemed enough to keep the biting cold at bay. There were mornings when Marcus woke to find his tears had frozen on his cheeks, having cried silently in the night from a combination of bone-deep, cold, gnawing hunger and the crushing loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed him despite Rusty's constant presence. On the worst days, when blizzards raged for days on end, trapping them inside their crumbling sanctuary with dwindling firewood and food supplies, the boy found himself staring into the flames of their meager fire, wondering if simply walking out into the storm might be easier than continuing to fight against such overwhelming odds. During one particularly brutal week, when their food had nearly run out and Marcus had developed a hacking cough that rattled painfully in his chest, he sank to his knees in the snow outside the church and sobbed openly, his strength finally failing him. But then came Rusty's concerned whine, the dog's cold nose pressing against his hand, amber eyes looking to him with complete trust and dependence that sparked something deep within Marcus's frozen spirit. It was Rusty who saved him, not just with companionship, but with purpose. The dog needed him, relied on him, and that responsibility became an anchor that held Marcus to life when despair threatened to sweep him away. Together, they developed winter routines that meant survival. Marcus learned to dig through snow to find hibernating ground squirrels in their burrows, to identify which bark could be boiled into bitter but nourishing tea, to insulate the church's remaining walls with packed snow that paradoxically kept precious heat from escaping. The boy worked constantly to maintain their shelter, patching holes in the roof with branches and pine boughs, building windbreaks from fallen trees, and creating an ingenious system of stones placed around their fire pit that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back during the endless freezing nights. Each small victory against winter's assault became a triumph they shared, finding an overlooked cache of pine nuts, successfully trapping a snowshoe hare, or managing to keep their fire burning through a particularly bitter night. And Marcus began marking the passing days with notches on a beam, each mark representing not just survival, but defiance against a world that had abandoned him, but failed to break him. By the time the first tentative signs of spring appeared, longer daylight hours, occasional dripping from icicles at midday, the distant honking of returning geese, Marcus had changed fundamentally. His body leaner and harder, his hands calloused and capable, and his spirit forged in winter's crucible into something remarkably resilient. Spring's arrival brought new courage to Marcus, who realized that despite his developing survival skills, there were necessities he simply couldn't forage or make: salt, proper tools, warmer clothes to replace his tattered and outgrown ones. So, with reluctance, he began making calculated visits to Pinecrest Village, leaving Rusty hidden at the church with firm commands to stay. His approach was cautious and strategic. He would arrive in the early morning hours when the village stirred to life, his appearance deliberately crafted, face washed in the stream, hair combed with his fingers, clothes brushed as clean as possible, avoid drawing unwanted attention or concern while still looking poor enough to earn sympathy. "Need any help today, ma'am?" became his standard greeting. Offered with downcast eyes to the shopkeepers and homeowners of Pinecrest, his voice practiced to sound confident rather than desperate, though inside he trembled with the fear of questions he couldn't answer. Marcus crafted a vague story about living with a reclusive uncle up the mountain, a tale that satisfied the villagers' minimal curiosity without inviting verification. The story granted him just enough legitimacy to be trusted with small tasks: stacking firewood behind the general store, sweeping the bakery porch, weeding gardens as spring bloomed into summer, USL, earning him modest payment in the form of bread, canned goods, a second-hand jacket, or occasionally a few coins that he saved obsessively in a tin box hidden beneath a stone in the church floor. Mrs. Holloway at the bakery slipped him extra rolls when her husband wasn't looking, old mister. Jenkins taught him to sharpen tools properly while paying him to organize his shed, and the proprietor of the general store allowed Marcus to sweep the storeroom in exchange for damaged goods that couldn't be sold. These small kindnesses sustained him, yet Marcus maintained careful distance, never lingering to chat, always declining offers to come inside for a proper meal, and vanishing back up the mountain before anyone could follow or ask too many questions. The villagers spoke of him occasionally. "That mountain boy," they called him, or Jenkins' helper, their perceptions colored by their own assumptions about mountain families being private and sometimes strange in their ways, but no one suspected the truth, that this increasingly capable child, with calloused hands and watchful eyes, had survived a winter alone in the wilderness that he returned not to a cabin with a guardian, but to a ruined church where his only family was a copper-colored dog. As spring ripened into summer, Marcus became a familiar fixture in the village, his wild independence mistaken for the typical resilience of mountain children. While he carefully guarded his secrets, growing increasingly skilled at navigating the human world during his brief visits, before retreating to the sanctuary of his church, where each new acquisition, a proper knife, a cooking pot, packets of seeds, represented not just improved comfort but tangible proof of his adaptation to a life that had once seemed impossible to bear. Late summer brought scorching days that drove Marcus to seek shade in the village, where he found himself clearing fallen branches from old Mrs. Winters's yard, a task that earned him a glass of precious lemonade served on her shaded porch. Unlike other villagers, the ancient woman with cloud-white hair and hands gnarled like tree roots asked questions that probed beyond his rehearsed answers, her pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence despite her 92 years. "You're living in the old mountain church, aren't you, boy?" she asked suddenly, causing Marcus to choke on his lemonade, his panicked eyes meeting her, knowing gaze as she chuckled softly. "Don't worry, I won't tell. Been watching you head up that forgotten trail for months now." Relief mingled with curiosity as Marcus cautiously admitted the truth, prompting Mrs. Winters to share what she knew of his sanctuary. That church was built by the first families who settled these mountains back in 1887. My grandfather among them, 38 souls who believed God had called them to create a community close to heaven. Her voice took on a rhythmic quality as she described how those pioneers had hauled stone by stone up the mountainside using mules and sheer determination, working through 3 summers to complete the sturdy structure that stood for decades as the spiritual center of what was once a thriving mining community. The church bell could be heard for miles, she reminisced, calling folks from scattered homesteads every Sunday, through blizzards and spring floods alike, until the great landslide of '52. Marcus leaned forward as she described how heavy spring rains had loosened the mountainside above the main settlement, sending a devastating flow of mud and rocks that wiped out half the community in a single night, sparing the church itself, but cutting off the main trail that led to it. In the aftermath, as families moved away and the mining operations closed, the church became too difficult to reach for regular services. People said it was a sign, Mrs. Winters said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, that God had turned his face from that place, abandoned it, just as the settlement was abandoned. They call it the church God forgot, though I never believed such nonsense myself. The old woman's eyes took on a distant look as she added that her own husband had been the last minister to hold service there, trudging faithfully up the difficult path until his death in 1963, after which the church was left to the elements, visited occasionally by hikers or teenagers looking for adventure, but otherwise surrendered to the slow reclamation of nature and time. As Marcus prepared to leave, Mrs. Winters pressed a small Bible into his hands, her fingers surprisingly strong around his wrist as she told him, "No place is forgotten by God, boy. Not even a broken church. Certainly not a boy with your courage." Leaving Marcus to wonder on his journey home how much this perceptive old woman truly understood about his situation, and whether the ruined church might indeed hold deeper purpose than mere shelter, the mountain spring arrived with explosive vitality, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and awakening dormant life in every crevice and corner of the church. Marcus first noticed it one morning when sunlight streamed through the broken eastern window, illuminating a cluster of purple columbines that had somehow taken root in a pile of debris near what had once been the altar. Fascinated, he began to observe more closely the persistent life emerging throughout his stone sanctuary, delicate alpine daisies pushing through cracks in the floor, wild strawberry vines twining between fallen roof beams, and vibrant moss painting, weathered stones with velvety green life that softened their harsh angles and brought unexpected beauty to decay. Mrs. Winter's words echoed in his mind. No place is forgotten by God. As he watched butterflies drift through holes in the roof to visit these unexpected blooms, bees buzzing industriously among flowers that thrived where prayer books had once rested, and birds building nests in the protected corners of what remained of the rafters. The church wasn't dead or abandoned, he realized, but transforming into something new. One particularly vibrant morning, as sunlight filtered through a section of roof where missing shingles created a dappled pattern across the stone floor, Marcus found himself standing in the center of the sanctuary, turning slowly to absorb the space with new eyes, not seeing ruin, but possibility. "It's like us, Rusty," he whispered to the dog, sprawled contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "Everyone left it behind, but it's still standing, still alive." That moment marked a profound shift in Marcus's thinking. The church was no longer merely shelter against the elements, but a canvas of potential, a place that could be transformed just as he himself had been transformed by survival. As he moved through the space, ideas blossomed like the wildflowers around him. The collapsed section of wall could become a garden open to the sky. The intact corner could be properly sealed for warmth. The trickling water that leaked through the roof during rain could be channeled and collected rather than avoided. With growing excitement, Marcus realized that with the skills he'd developed and the materials he could gradually collect, he might not just survive in this forgotten place, but truly live, creating something beautiful from abandonment, purpose from loss. That night, as stars appeared through the broken roof and Rusty snored softly beside him, Marcus felt something unfamiliar expanding in his chest, something he eventually recognized as hope. Not the desperate hope of rescue or return that had sustained him during those first terrible days of abandonment, but a new hope built on self-reliance and possibility, the profound realization that he could shape his own sanctuary from the ruins life had given him, just as the persistent wildflowers had transformed stone and debris into a garden of unexpected beauty. The transition from survival to creation began with small, determined steps as Marcus collected the scattered tools of his new purpose, CO1. A hammer and handful of nails traded for clearing the general store's storage shed, a trowel with a cracked handle discarded behind the village garden center, a handsaw found rusting at the village dump but revived with careful cleaning and sharpening. Each morning now had purpose beyond mere survival, as Marcus tackled the most pressing problems first, the leaking roof that turned their sleeping area into a puddle during rainstorms. Balancing carefully on the remaining rafters, he patched holes with overlapping pieces of bark and flat stones, creating a crude but effective barrier against the elements while planning for more permanent solutions as his resources grew. The church floor, long buried under decades of fallen debris, gradually emerged as Marcus cleared away rotted wood, crumbled stone, and the accumulated detritus of abandonment, revealing beautiful flagstones worn smooth by generations of faithful feet. Each cleared section felt like reclaiming territory from wilderness, expanding their usable space while uncovering the church's hidden character. The area around the altar, where light poured in most abundantly through the partially collapsed eastern wall, became Marcus's first deliberate garden. Inspired by the wildflowers that had shown him the possibility, he carefully transplanted the naturally occurring blooms, supplementing them with seedlings grown from packets obtained in the village, arranging them in concentric circles that captured the morning light and filled their home with fragrance and color. Rusty observed these transformations with curious interest, sometimes helping by digging where directed, but mostly serving as appreciative audience to Marcus's growing vision, his approving bark echoing through the stone sanctuary whenever a significant improvement was completed. As summer progressed, so did Marcus's ambitions, MB. He fashioned rudimentary furniture from fallen logs and branches, created storage areas in the remaining vestry, and built a more efficient fireplace using stones and clay from the nearby stream, reducing smoke and increasing warmth. The work was exhausting, often frustrating as his inexperienced hands struggled with tasks that required skills he was still developing. Yet, each small victory, a section of wall cleared of debris, a patch of roof that remained dry during rainfall, seedlings that took root in his carefully prepared garden, and cat, brought satisfaction unlike anything Marcus had known before. This wasn't merely surviving in a forgotten place, but actively transforming it, claiming it, making it truly his own through the investment of his labor and imagination. By summer's end, though the church still bore the unmistakable marks of ruin, patches of order and intentional beauty had begun to emerge from chaos. The first tentative steps in a transformation that mirrored the one taking place within the boy himself, who was gradually becoming less a victim of abandonment and more a creator of his own destiny. The encounter that would transform Marcus's efforts from amateur to accomplished happened on an autumn day when he ventured farther than usual in search of clay for his ongoing repairs. Following a stream to its source, he stumbled upon a small cabin nestled so perfectly into the mountainside that he initially mistook it for a natural formation until smoke from its chimney betrayed human presence. Before Marcus could retreat, he found himself facing a weathered man with a silver beard reaching to his chest and eyes the same gray-blue as the distant peaks, who introduced himself simply as Thomas before inviting the startled boy to share a cup of pine needle tea. Initial wariness gave way to fascination as Marcus discovered that Thomas had lived alone on the mountain for over 40 years. Having come seeking solitude after returning broken from Vietnam, finding healing in the mountains that human society couldn't provide. Recognizing in Marcus a kindred spirit, another soul seeking refuge and rebuilding, Thomas began sharing knowledge accumulated through decades of self-reliant mountain living. "You're fighting the mountain, boy," he observed after hearing about Marcus's struggles with the church repairs. "Need to learn to dance with it instead," and thus began an apprenticeship where Marcus would visit Thomas's cabin twice weekly, returning to the church with precious skills and wisdom. The old hermit taught with calloused hands and patient instruction, demonstrating how to split logs precisely along their grain, how to mix clay and sand in perfect proportion for lasting mortar, how to read the mountain signals in shifting winds and cloud patterns, and, most importantly, how to build structures that worked in harmony with the land's natural tendencies rather than in opposition to them. "Water always finds its path," Thomas would say, showing Marcus how to channel rather than block the runoff that threatened his roof, or "stone speaks if you listen," teaching him to find the natural breaking points in rocks that made shaping them to his needs infinitely easier. Beyond practical skills, Thomas shared his philosophy of mountain life, teaching Marcus to approach his sanctuary not as something to be conquered, but as a living partner in creation. Under the hermit's guidance, the boy's repairs and improvements took on new sophistication, incorporating the natural flow of light, the prevailing direction of wind, and the movement of water into designs that seemed to grow organically from the church ruins rather than being imposed upon them. As autumn painted the mountainside in russet and gold, Marcus found himself transformed not just by new skills, but by Thomas's underlying wisdom. Rossadu, that broken things held beauty and potential, that patience often accomplished what force could not, and that true strength came from adaptation rather than resistance, lessons that applied as much to the abandoned boy as to the abandoned church they were gradually bringing back to life. Seasons cycled through their eternal rhythm, his teacher, winter's brutal cleansing, spring's hopeful renewal, summer's abundant growth, autumn's contemplative harvest, is a teacher, and with each passing year, Marcus grew taller, stronger, his body adapting to mountain life with the same resilience as the pines that bent but never broke beneath winter snow. The small, frightened boy, who had once huddled weeping in a garden shed, gradually transformed into a lean, capable teenager whose confident movements through the forest betrayed an intimacy with the mountain few ever achieved. By 14, his hands had grown calloused and skilled, able to craft tools from wood and bone, to build sturdy furniture that filled the increasingly comfortable church interior, and to coax surprising abundance from garden beds constructed within and around the stone walls of his sanctuary. Marcus's education came not from schools but from direct experience. A physics of water flow taught by redirecting streams to irrigate his expanding gardens, mathematics learned through precise measurement and calculation of building materials, biology absorbed through intimate observation of plant cycles and animal behaviors that most people never noticed. Thomas continued as mentor and friend, marveling at how quickly the boy integrated new knowledge, often adapting techniques in ways the older man hadn't considered. "You've got mountain wisdom growing in you," he would say, noting how Marcus could now predict weather changes before they appeared, could identify edible plants instantly, could move through dense forest with nearly supernatural quiet, that even Rusty, now graying around the muzzle but still vital, struggled to match. The church transformation mirrored Marcus's own. Marcus's calm. What had once been desperate shelter now stood as an extraordinary fusion of architecture and nature, with walls partially rebuilt yet intentionally open in places to incorporate living trees, roof sections carefully designed to capture rainwater while allowing dappled sunlight to nourish interior gardens, and clever innovations like the stone-lined channels that directed stream water through the sanctuary in summer, providing cooling, irrigation, and the constant music of flowing water. Local wildlife had gradually accepted the human presence, with birds nesting in purpose-built shelves in the walls, deer grazing comfortably in the meadow. Marcus had expanded beyond the eastern wall, and even the occasional fox or mountain lion passing through with respectful acknowledgement rather than fear or aggression. When Marcus looked at his reflection in the clear pool he'd created near the altar, a young man with sun-darkened skin, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and the confident bearing of someone wholly at home in his environment, he sometimes found it nearly impossible to connect this image with the abandoned, weeping child of his memories. The mountains had raised him as surely as any parent, teaching him not just survival, but a profound understanding of his place within the natural world, a wisdom, beyond his 16 years, that he carried not as pride, but as quiet certainty. The bond between boy and dog had deepened through shared years and seasons, making it all the more terrifying when Rusty, now entering his elder years, suddenly collapsed one autumn morning. His breathing labored, and his normally bright eyes clouded with pain. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest, a fear more profound than any winter storm had ever produced, as he realized this was beyond his considerable wilderness knowledge to heal. Without hesitation, Marcus gathered the weakened dog into his arms, wrapping him in a blanket despite the unseasonably warm day, and began the journey down to the village with his precious burden. No longer concerned about maintaining the careful distance he'd cultivated over years of brief, purpose-driven visits. The village veterinarian, Dr. Abrams, had just unlocked her clinic door when she spotted the wild-looking teenager approaching with determination in his stride and fear in his eyes, cradling a bundle that whimpered weakly against his chest. "Please," was all Marcus managed to say, his voice breaking as he stood in her doorway, no longer the self-sufficient mountain dweller, but simply a terrified boy facing the potential loss of his only family. Dr. Abrams worked quickly and efficiently, examining Rusty with gentle hands while asking questions that Marcus answered with surprising medical precision, and when symptoms began, what Rusty had eaten recently, changes in behavior, revealing an observational acuity that impressed the veterinarian, even as her professional concern deepened at the dog's condition. Kidney failure, she eventually diagnosed, noting the dog's advanced age and explaining the need for medication, special diet, and possibly intravenous fluids, watching carefully as Marcus's expression shifted from fear to calculation, clearly assessing resources he didn't have. When she gently inquired where he lived and who might help with Rusty's care, Marcus's evasive answers and the protective way he stroked the dog's head told Dr. Abrams more than any words could. Hours passed as they worked together to stabilize Rusty, the dog responding gradually to treatment, while Marcus refused to leave his side. His focus so complete that he didn't notice how Dr. Abrams studied his sun-weathered face, his calloused hands, the primitive but effective herbal poultice he'd applied to Rusty's paw pad, where a secondary infection had developed. Details that painted a picture increasingly at odds with the vague story of a reclusive uncle that Marcus had maintained for years. As evening approached and Rusty rested more comfortably on a blanket near the clinic's heater, Dr. Abrams placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, offering him a plate of food and asking with careful neutrality, "You've been taking care of him alone, haven't you? And not just the dog?" A question that hung in the air between them as Marcus met her eyes with a wariness born of years of necessary secrecy, balanced against his desperate need for help to save the companion who had saved him from despair so many years before. Dr. Abrams kept Marcus's secret for exactly 3 days before concern for the boy's welfare overcame professional discretion, sharing what she'd learned with Sheriff Collins over coffee at the village diner. By nightfall, the story had rippled through Pinecrest like water over stones, the revelation that the quiet, capable mountain boy who'd done odd jobs for years was actually living alone in the abandoned church, surviving through his own ingenuity and determination since childhood. Initial reactions mixed shock with disbelief, then splintered into contradictory impulses. Some villagers advocated immediately contacting child services, while others, particularly those who had employed Marcus and witnessed his remarkable self-sufficiency, argued that conventional intervention might do more harm than good. "That boy's more capable at 16 than most men I know," declared Mr. Jenkins at an impromptu gathering at the general store, his weathered face flushing with unexpected pride as he described Marcus's skill with tools and unfailing reliability. Village opinion gradually coalesced around cautious respect rather than intervention, especially after Thomas the Hermit made a rare appearance in town, speaking eloquently of Marcus's extraordinary adaptation to mountain life and the sanctuary he'd created at the old church. "You drag that boy into the system now, and you'll break something beautiful," the old man warned, his reputation for wisdom lending weight to his words. Curiosity replaced judgment as villagers began sharing their own Marcus stories, Mrs. Holloway revealing how he'd rebuilt her garden wall without being asked after a spring storm damaged it. The librarian describing how she'd discovered him teaching himself algebra from borrowed textbooks. The general store owner admitting that Marcus had been paying back every item he'd ever been given through increasingly skilled labor. A tentative new understanding emerged among the villagers, a recognition that their community had unknowingly participated in raising a child of remarkable resilience, contributing small kindnesses that had helped sustain him, even as he had contributed to their lives through honest work and quiet determination. As autumn progressed, subtle changes marked the village's shifting relationship with Marcus. Extra supplies appearing without comment whenever he came to trade or work, casual invitations to share meals that respected his independence while offering genuine welcome, careful questions about the church restoration that acknowledged his accomplishment without prying into painful history. Most significant was Sheriff Collins's deliberate decision, after consulting with county authorities, to monitor Marcus's situation informally rather than forcing him into a system ill-equipped to handle such an unconventional case. "Sometimes," the sheriff told concerned officials, "the best thing we can do is recognize when a different path is working." His gruff exterior softening as he described the transformation of an abandoned child into a young man who had not just survived, but in many ways thrived through challenges that would have broken most adults. The first deliberate visitors arrived on a crisp October morning, when the mountain foliage blazed with autumn color. Dr. Abrams, who had continued to help with Rusty's care, Sheriff Collins, whose official interest had evolved into genuine concern, Mrs. Holloway from the bakery, and Thomas, serving as guide along the overgrown trail that wound up the mountainside toward the church that had taken on almost mythical status in village conversations. Marcus had received warning of their coming through Thomas and had spent anxious days preparing, torn between pride in what he'd created and fear of judgment or, worse, intervention that might separate him from the only home where he'd found peace. He stood, waiting at the edge of the clearing as the small group emerged from the forest path. Rusty, thinner but recovering, alert at his side. The collective gasp as the visitors beheld the transformation before them was audible even across the clearing. What had once been ruins now stood as something between restoration and reimagination. Hiase, partially rebuilt stone walls, integrated with living trees, a roof ingeniously patched with a combination of salvaged materials and carefully cultivated moss that blended structure with nature, windows once shattered, now graced with intricate lattices that held colored glass fragments, creating rainbow patterns across the interior when sunlight streamed through them. Sheriff Collins removed his hat in unconscious reverence as they approached, following Marcus through the arched entryway into a space that defied all expectations, where church pews had once stood in rigid rows, garden beds now curved in harmonious patterns, vegetables and flowers intermingling in productive beauty. The altar area had become a small pond fed by a diverted stream, water lilies floating on its surface while small fish darted in the clear depths. Sleeping quarters had been constructed in the former vestry, simple but comfortable with a small wood stove providing heat, and everywhere evidence of patient craftsmanship. Furniture built from salvaged wood, tools arranged on handmade racks, baskets of harvested produce hanging from newly constructed rafters. Mrs. Holloway wiped tears from her eyes as she turned slowly in the center of the sanctuary, murmuring, "It's more beautiful than it ever was before," while Dr. Abrams studied the medicinal herbs growing in carefully tended beds along one wall, recognizing plants she herself prescribed in modern form. What moved the visitors most deeply was not just the physical transformation, but the profound peace of the place. Birds nesting in rafters, butterflies drifting through open sections of roof, sunlight and shadow playing across stone floors in patterns that seemed almost deliberately designed, all creating a sanctuary that honored both the church's original purpose and its new life as a harmonious fusion of human dwelling and natural world. As they shared the simple meal Marcus had prepared, seated on log benches around a central fire pit where the nave had once been, the visitors' initial amazement gradually shifted to genuine respect, their conversation flowing more easily as they recognized that they were not witnessing the desperate survival of an abandoned child, but rather the extraordinary achievement of a young man who had transformed rejection into creation, loneliness into communion with nature, and ruins into renewal. The visitors' amazement rippled back through Pinecrest Village, transforming curiosity into genuine support as villagers began making the trek up the mountain, each bringing gifts that reflected their own skills and recognition of Marcus's extraordinary vision. Mr. Jenkins arrived with proper woodworking tools and spent afternoons teaching Marcus advanced joinery techniques. Mrs. Winters sent her grandson with heritage seed packets saved through generations. The hardware store owner delivered discounted materials that would have been impossible for Marcus to salvage or craft himself. What began as occasional assistance soon evolved into an informal community project, with different villagers contributing according to their abilities. End quote. The glassblower creating proper window panes for the sections Marcus wanted fully enclosed, a retired contractor offering engineering advice for stabilizing the bell tower that Marcus dreamed of restoring, amateur botanists identifying rare alpine plants that might thrive in the church's unique microclimate. Marcus absorbed each new skill with remarkable speed, his natural intelligence finally nourished by knowledge beyond what survival alone had taught him. He learned to create proper mortar that would withstand mountain winters, to calculate load-bearing requirements for new roof sections, to propagate plant species that complemented each other in his expanding gardens. The church transformation accelerated exponentially. The western wall, once crumbling, now stood solid with integrated planter boxes from which ivy cascaded. The roof became a carefully designed system of both enclosed and open sections, some channeling rainwater into the interior pond, others supporting alpine rock gardens visible from below. The bell tower, structurally reinforced, once again housed the original bell, discovered half buried nearby and painstakingly restored to functional condition. Most remarkable was Marcus's vision of integration. He didn't simply rebuild the church to its original form, but reimagined it as a living entity where architecture and nature existed in harmonious partnership. Trees grew through deliberately created openings in the roof, their branches forming natural support columns. Stream water flowed through stone channels crossing the sanctuary floor, providing irrigation, natural cooling, and the constant music of flowing water. Climbing plants were trained along interior walls in patterns that complemented the building's structure while softening its stone austerity. Through this collaborative restoration, Marcus's relationship with the village transformed as well. No longer the distant mountain boy who appeared for odd jobs before vanishing again, he became recognized as a young man of extraordinary vision and capability, still fiercely independent, but now connected to a community that had collectively decided to support rather than interfere with his unconventional life, protecting him from well-meaning outside authorities while providing the resources and knowledge that allowed his sanctuary to evolve from simple survival shelter to something approaching genuine paradise. On the morning of his 19th birthday, Marcus sat alone on the bell tower's newly constructed observation platform, watching dawnlight illuminate the valley below as it had countless times before, yet seeing it somehow differently through the eyes of emerging adulthood. 12 years had passed since that day at the signpost. Years marked by the gradual transformation of both the abandoned church and the abandoned boy into something neither was ever intended to be, yet something profoundly right. The realization had been coming slowly, crystallizing in quiet moments between the physical labor of creation and one. While watching sunlight filter through colored glass onto garden soil, or listening to birdsong echo through stone arches, or feeling the satisfying weight of tools that had become extensions of his hands, that what had begun as desperate survival had evolved into something far more significant. "I didn't just fix a building," Marcus whispered to Rusty, now elderly and moving slowly but still faithful at his side. "I was fixing myself," understanding suddenly that each repaired wall had mended something within him. Each garden planted had grown new hope in soil, once barren with despair. Each beautiful element incorporated into the sanctuary had been a reclamation of beauty in a life that had begun with rejection. The church stood now as a physical manifestation of his own healing journey. Some sighed, not restored to its original purpose, but transformed into something that honored both what it had been and what abandonment had allowed it to become. Just as Marcus himself had grown not into what conventional life might have shaped, but into something unique and unexpectedly whole, despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges that had forged him. He understood now why visitors from the village often fell silent when entering his sanctuary, why some wiped away tears, why several had confided that they found peace here, they'd searched for elsewhere without success. He had created not just a dwelling, but a testament to renewal, a living demonstration that broken things need not remain broken, that abandonment could be the beginning rather than the end of a story. As he descended from the tower to begin the day's work on a stained glass window he was creating from fragments collected over years, Marcus felt the weight of purpose settle comfortably across his shoulders. Understanding that his life had value beyond mere survival, when the transforming devastation into beauty, he offered hope to others damaged by life's cruelties. That in creating harmony between human structure and natural world, He demonstrated possibility to those trapped in conventional thinking, that, in building this sanctuary from materials others had discarded, he proved the potential for renewal that existed in all broken things and abandoned souls. The morning sun warmed his face as he gathered his tools, no longer driven by fear or need but by creative purpose, his heart as open as the church's roof to the endless sky above and all the possibilities it contained. With the church structure now stable and harmoniously integrated with nature, Marcus turned his attention outward to the surrounding grounds, envisioning not just a garden, but a living sanctuary that would extend the church's renewal into the mountain landscape itself. What had once been rocky, neglected soil surrounding the stone building gradually transformed under his patient hands into a series of interconnected garden spaces, each designed with specific purpose yet flowing together in natural harmony. Marcus applied everything he'd learned about the mountain's ecology, studying migration patterns of birds, observing which native plants attracted different pollinators, and mapping the subtle microclimates created by the church's stone walls and the surrounding trees to create gardens that served both beauty and function in equal measure. The southern exposure became a butterfly haven, filled with carefully selected nectar plants arranged in spiraling patterns that provided continuous blooming from early spring through late autumn, and duck-purple coneflowers, bright orange milkweed, delicate yarrow, and dozens of other species that soon attracted clouds of painted ladies, swallowtails, and even the rare mountain fritillary that danced like living stained glass above the colorful blooms. The western side, partially shaded by towering pines, transformed into a bird sanctuary with native berry bushes, seed-producing perennials, and strategically placed water features that rang with birdsong from dawn to dusk, while nesting boxes crafted from salvaged wood and integrated into living trees soon housed families of chickadees, nuthatches, and even a pair of kestrels that claimed the highest box as their own. The northern garden became a peaceful meditation space with plants chosen for texture and sound, tall grasses that whispered in mountain breezes, aspen saplings whose leaves shimmered like coins in the slightest air movement, nonto sticks, while the eastern slope was devoted to medicinal herbs and edible landscaping, practical plants arranged with such artistic vision that villagers often sketched or photographed the patterns for their own gardens. Most remarkable was how quickly these intentional plantings attracted wildlife beyond Marcus's initial planning, R9. Hummingbirds discovered the trumpet vines within days of their first blooms. Beneficial insects established colonies that kept garden pests naturally in balance, and eventually even larger animals began to visit, with deer regularly browsing the meadow edges and a fox family establishing a den nearby, seemingly untroubled by the human presence that had become as much a part of the mountain's natural rhythm as the changing seasons. Village children who visited began calling it the church where everything grows, an apt description for this place, where boundaries between building and landscape, between human creation and natural world, had dissolved into a seamless ecosystem that hummed with life and radiated the peculiar peace that comes from things existing exactly as they were meant to be. What began as local admiration inevitably expanded beyond Pinecrest's boundaries as visitors told others of the extraordinary sanctuary on the mountainside, their descriptions carrying with them the seeds of legend that grew with each retelling. A travel writer staying at the village inn heard the story from Mrs. Holloway, resulting in a magazine feature that described the church as a living cathedral where nature and spirit have found perfect harmony. The article, accompanied by photographs that captured sunlight streaming through glass mosaic windows onto gardens growing between stone arches, sparked interest among people hungry for authentic experiences in a world increasingly dominated by artificial attractions. They began arriving in small groups, making the pilgrimage up the mountain path, often skeptical of villagers' enthusiastic descriptions until they rounded the final bend and stood speechless before the reality that exceeded all expectations. Marcus, now 20, initially retreated from these strangers, uncomfortable with their curious gazes and probing questions about his history, but gradually developed a quiet protocol. With visitors, were welcome to experience the sanctuary if they respected its peace, contributed in some small way, sades, labor, or knowledge, and understood that this was not a tourist attraction but a living home, where human, animal, and plant existed in deliberate balance. Most remarkable were the varied people drawn to the mountain miracle: burned-out professionals seeking respite from corporate exhaustion, environmental architects studying the seamless integration of structure and nature, grieving individuals who found comfort in a place where beauty had emerged from abandonment, spiritual seekers from diverse traditions, who recognized in this unconventional sanctuary a genuine sacredness that transcended religious boundaries. Marcus observed how visitors often arrived, tense and distracted, but departed, visibly transformed, moving more slowly, speaking more softly, their faces reflecting the same peace that had gradually healed his own wounded spirit over the years. He began to understand that his creation offered something increasingly rare in the modern world, a place where human ingenuity honored rather than conquered nature, where beauty emerged organically rather than being imposed, and where the redemptive power of patient creation was demonstrated in every stone, plant, and beam. Local authorities, initially concerned about zoning regulations and building codes, found themselves reluctant to interfere with a place that so clearly benefited visitors and brought positive attention to the region. Instead, the county quietly established the area as a cultural heritage site with special conservation status, simultaneously protecting the sanctuary from commercial development while acknowledging its significance as a unique example of environmental rehabilitation and architectural reimagination, official recognition that amused Marcus, even as it provided additional protection for the mountain paradise he had created from ruins and rejection. The confrontation Marcus had never imagined arrived on a golden autumn afternoon, when Thomas hurried up the path, unusually agitated, to inform him that a couple claiming to be his parents had appeared in the village, asking directions to the church sanctuary. Years of healing suddenly seemed paper-thin, as Marcus's hands trembled while feeding the sanctuary's birds, his mind flooding with the memory of that blue sweater, the waiting at the signpost, and the devastating realization of abandonment that had shaped his entire life. They arrived an hour later, a prematurely aged woman with familiar eyes and a thin man with stooped shoulders, both appearing simultaneously smaller and more ordinary than the mythic monsters and saviors they had alternately been in Marcus's imagination over the years. The initial moments passed in awkward silence, broken only by the woman's gasp of recognition, followed by tears as she whispered, "Marcus?" reaching toward him with hesitant hands that he neither accepted nor rejected. The story emerged in halting fragments: a nodder, devastating poverty, his mother's cancer diagnosis without insurance, the father's job loss and spiraling depression, their desperate belief that a clean break might give their child a chance at adoption by a family with resources they could never provide. "We thought someone would find you quickly," his father said, eyes fixed on the ground. "We left you near houses, not in wilderness," words that revealed how little they had understood about the remoteness of Pinecrest or the likelihood of a child being overlooked in a transient mountain community. They had seen the magazine article with its description of the abandoned boy who created paradise, recognized details that could only describe their son, and spent months tracking down the location, driven by what they described as unrelenting remorse and desperate hope for forgiveness. "We don't deserve it," his mother admitted, her face showing the years of pain that had followed their impossible choice. Marcus stood silent through their explanation, his expression unreadable as emotions battled within. The child in him wanting to scream accusations, the survivor wanting to show how magnificently he had thrived despite their betrayal, and some deeper part, recognizing in their broken postures and haunted eyes fellow humans who had also suffered from the choice that had defined his life. As afternoon light filtered through the sanctuary's colored windows, painting his parents' faces with fractured rainbow patterns, Marcus felt something shift within. Not the simple forgiveness they sought, nor the bitter rejection they perhaps expected, but something more complex and truthful emerging from the person he had become in this place where broken things found new purpose. "I can't give you what you're looking for today," he finally said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "But I can show you what I've built here. And perhaps we can begin to know each other as we are now, rather than who we were then." An offer that acknowledged the irreparable past while tentatively opening toward a future neither party could yet imagine. A response that reflected not weakness, but the profound strength of someone who understood that healing, like the sanctuary itself, couldn't be rushed, but must grow naturally in its own time and pattern. Rusty's aging body had slowed considerably over the past year, his once copper fur now heavily frosted with white, yet his loyalty remained unwavering as he maintained his position as guardian of the sanctuary, despite creaking joints and dimming eyesight. The arrival of Willow, a young border collie mix who had followed hikers to the church and simply refused to leave, had initially been met with Rusty's dignified tolerance that gradually warmed into companionship and, to Marcus's amazement, resulted in a litter of 7 puppies that now tumbled across the sanctuary floors and garden paths like living extensions of the joy that had been growing in this place for years. Marcus watched with quiet amusement as Rusty assumed his role as patriarch with surprising vigor, summoning energy that seemed impossible for his elderly frame as he supervised the puppies' explorations, correcting them with gentle nips when they ventured too close to dangerous areas, demonstrating with exaggerated movements how to dig properly in designated garden spaces rather than flower beds, and settling beside them during afternoon naps with an expression of unmistakable pride. The puppies, each displaying some combination of Rusty's rust-colored markings and Willow's sleek black and white patterns, represented more than just new life in the sanctuary. They embodied continuity in the form that had mattered most during Marcus's darkest hours, the loyal canine companionship that had given him reason to continue when human connection had proven devastating. On cool evenings when the puppies piled together in the large basket near the wood stove, Marcus often found himself sitting beside Rusty, hand resting on the old dog's head, sharing memories only they, two, possessed. The first meeting when both were wounded and alone, the discovery of the church, the terrible winter they had survived together, and all the years of building that followed. Understanding that while the sanctuary's physical transformation was visible to all visitors, only Rusty had witnessed the parallel transformation of Marcus himself from abandoned child to capable young man. "You saved me before I even knew how to save myself," Marcus whispered to the old dog one evening, receiving in return the same steadfast gaze that had sustained him through countless challenges. A silent communication perfected through years of partnership that needed no human language to convey its depth. As Marcus watched the puppies grow week by week, selecting homes for most among trusted friends while keeping 2, a male with Rusty's soulful eyes and a female with his distinctive ear markings, he recognized that while individual lives were finite, the connections between them could continue, ensuring that something of Rusty's faithful spirit would remain in the sanctuary he had helped create, extending the legacy of loyal companionship that had transformed abandonment into belonging for a boy who had once believed himself entirely alone in an indifferent world. The inevitable collision between Marcus's private sanctuary and public interest arrived in the form of Dr. Eleanor Chen, the regional conservation director whose initial informal visit transformed into official interest when she recognized the site's unique ecological and cultural significance. Accompanied by colleagues on her return, she presented Marcus with proposals, architectural renderings, and preservation grants that would designate the church as a protected heritage site while providing resources for continued restoration and maintenance. The potential benefits were substantial: legal protection from future development, financial support that would free Marcus from dependence on odd jobs and visitor donations, and expert assistance with structural challenges he still struggled to address. Yet the costs seemed equally significant, as Marcus studied plans showing designated pathways, interpretive signs, visiting hours, and the infrastructure needed to accommodate growing public interest. "This place saved my life," Marcus explained to Dr. Chen as they sat in the garden, watching butterflies dance above late-blooming asters. "Not just by providing shelter, but by giving me space to heal on my own terms," his concern evident as he questioned whether the sanctuary could maintain its essential character under management that, however well-intentioned, would inevitably bring regulations and standardization. For weeks, Marcus wrestled with the decision, seeking counsel from those he trusted most. Thomas advised protecting his independence at all costs, while Mrs. Winters reminded him that true sanctuaries had always balanced privacy with accessibility to those in need, perspectives that reflected the fundamental tension between the sanctuary as personal refuge and as inspirational public space. The resolution came not through logical analysis, but through quiet observation one afternoon as Marcus watched visitors experience the sanctuary, a grieving widow finding comfort among the memorial plants. Visitors had begun adding to the garden, environmental students sketching the rainwater collection system for implementation elsewhere, a troubled teenager visibly relaxing as he helped feed the sanctuary animals, moments that crystallized the understanding that what he had created held value beyond his personal healing. "I'll accept the designation," Marcus finally told Dr. Chen, with conditions, proceeding to outline terms that would preserve the sanctuary's essential character: limited visiting hours with days reserved for private contemplation, decisions about physical changes remaining ultimately with Marcus rather than committees, and, most importantly, maintaining the space as a living ecosystem rather than a static monument. As Marcus signed the preliminary agreement that would begin the formal protection process, he felt not the surrendering of his creation, but its natural evolution, understanding that just as the abandoned church had provided sanctuary to a homeless boy years ago, its purpose now expanded to offer similar healing to others while remaining true to the organic, adaptive spirit that had guided its transformation from ruins to paradise. What had begun as private salvation could now extend its gifts without losing its soul, a balance reflecting Marcus's own journey from isolation to measured, authentic connection with the world beyond his mountain. The sanctuary's evolution into a healing space for others crystallized one rainy afternoon when Sheriff Collins arrived with 16-year-old Jason, a troubled teen facing juvenile detention for vandalism, asking if Marcus would consider an alternative to the system that had nearly claimed him years ago. 2 weeks in the mountains might show him possibilities that jail cells never could, the sheriff suggested, leaving Marcus to recognize his own past reflected in Jason's defensive posture and wary eyes. What began as reluctant community service, NDT, Jason helping rebuild a section of wall damaged by spring storms, gradually transformed as the rhythm of sanctuary life worked its subtle magic. The teenager's tightly coiled anger, unwinding through physical labor, connection with animals, and evenings spent in conversation beside the fire, where Marcus shared carefully selected pieces of his own journey without pressure or judgment. Jason's transformation proved so remarkable that other troubled youth soon followed: a girl battling addiction, siblings from a broken home, a young man struggling with trauma, each arriving defensive and disconnected, each gradually finding something in the sanctuary's blend of natural beauty, purposeful work, and quiet acceptance that conventional therapy had failed to provide. Marcus discovered unexpected gifts as a guide, drawing from his own hard-earned wisdom to create experiences tailored to each young visitor, taking a rage-filled boy on a challenging hike that exhausted his body while expanding his horizons, teaching an anxious girl to cultivate seedlings that required the same gentle patience she needed to show herself, showing a withdrawn teen how to listen for bird calls that gradually awakened his attention to the world beyond his pain. "The mountains taught me when no human could," Marcus explained to Dr. Chen, who had helped formalize the program with modest funding and professional support. "And sometimes, troubled spirits need wisdom that doesn't come in human voice," a philosophy that informed every aspect of what participants now called the Mountain Calling, a program neither fully wilderness therapy nor traditional mentoring, but something uniquely born of Marcus's own healing journey and the sanctuary that had grown from abandonment. The youth built trails, tended gardens, restored stonework, and cared for animals, yet the most profound transformations occurred in moments between activities: sunset conversations on the bell tower, silent mornings tracking deer through mountain mist, shared meals harvested from garden beds they had helped plant, experiences that reconnected fragmented young lives to natural rhythms larger than their pain. As Marcus observed Jason, now returning as a volunteer mentor for newer participants, explaining to a recently arrived teen how mountain salamanders could regrow lost limbs, his metaphor about resilience, delivered not as lesson but as wonder shared between equals, he recognized that his sanctuary had completed an essential circle. What began as one abandoned child's desperate survival had evolved into a place where brokenness of many kinds could find not just acceptance but transformation, where the mountains continued their patient work of healing, with Marcus now serving as translator of their ancient wisdom to young hearts still learning the language of hope. Her name was Sophia, a 7-year-old with solemn eyes and silent tears, brought to the sanctuary by social services after being found abandoned at a bus station 2 towns over, her only possession a small backpack containing a worn, stuffed rabbit and a note with insufficient explanation. Marcus recognized himself immediately in her rigid posture and careful observation, the way she catalogued exits and evaluated threats, the precise emotional control that children should never need to master. Unlike the troubled teens who usually came to the sanctuary, Sophia arrived bearing the fresh wound of abandonment, still bleeding with confusion and raw betrayal that Marcus remembered in his bones. He approached her with the patience he would use for the most skittish wildlife, making no sudden movements toward connection, instead creating space where trust might eventually grow on its own terms. The first breakthrough came not through Marcus's efforts but through Willow's puppies, now gangly adolescents who approached Sophia with innocent curiosity, their playful tumbling gradually drawing small smiles and eventually tentative pats from hands that had remained clenched in protective fists during her first days at the sanctuary. Marcus watched from a respectful distance, recognizing the healing power of connection that asked nothing in return. Weeks passed in which Sophia moved through the sanctuary like a shadow, observing everything but participating minimally, until the morning Marcus found her in the butterfly garden, carefully placing fallen petals back on flowers in a heartbreaking attempt to fix what could not be repaired. Kneeling beside her without comment, Marcus began gathering petals of his own, then gently showed her how to scatter them around plant bases as natural mulch, whispering, "Sometimes broken things become something different but still beautiful." Words offered not as lecture, but as quiet truth learned through lived experience. The sanctuary worked its gradual magic as Sophia began assisting with simple tasks, collecting eggs from the chicken coop, watering seedlings in the greenhouse, filling bird feeders throughout the gardens, her movements growing more confident as she discovered her ability to nurture life rather than merely survive abandonment. The sanctuary staff noticed her beginning to speak in fragments, then sentences, then occasional bursts of childish curiosity that had been buried beneath trauma. On the anniversary of Marcus's own arrival at the church, Ayandel, a date he had always marked with private reflection, he found Sophia in the bell tower, gazing toward the distant mountains with the stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, sitting beside her in companionable silence. Marcus eventually shared the simplest version of his own story, not to diminish her pain, but to offer living proof of possible futures beyond abandonment. Watching, understanding dawn in eyes that had seen too much, yet still contained the capacity for hope. "Did you fix yourself here?" she asked in the direct way of children, her first full question directed to him, to which Marcus answered with careful honesty, "Not exactly. I'm still working on that. But I found out I could build something good even while broken." An answer that seemed to satisfy her as she nodded with the grave wisdom of the deeply wounded, reaching for his hand as they watched the sun set over mountains that had witnessed countless cycles of destruction and renewal, abandonment and reclamation, brokenness and healing. 20 years had passed since a frightened boy and wounded dog had stumbled upon an abandoned church. A milestone Marcus celebrated with quiet reflection as he stood in the bell tower, overlooking what visitors now traveled hundreds of miles to experience. The fully realized vision that had begun in desperate survival and evolved through patience, determination, and an intuitive understanding of how brokenness might be transformed rather than merely repaired. The church stood neither as ruin nor restoration, but as living entity, its original stone structure now seamlessly integrated with natural elements, ancient walls supporting canopies of climbing roses, a partial glass roof allowing sunlight to nourish interior gardens while preserving historical arches, streams channeled through stone floors in patterns that created both irrigation and music. A place where boundaries between human creation and natural world had dissolved into harmonious partnership that visitors often described as healing just to witness. The Mountain Calling program had grown to include a small staff of counselors and specialists, yet maintained its essential character through Marcus's unwavering vision, providing sanctuary to those whom conventional systems failed, particularly the abandoned and forgotten. Sophia, now a confident young woman studying environmental architecture, returned regularly to mentor newcomers, her journey from wounded child to capable adult serving as living testament to the sanctuary's transformative potential. Marcus himself had grown into a man of quiet wisdom, the abandoned child still visible in his watchful eyes, but now balanced by the earned serenity of someone who had transformed personal devastation into a gift for others. He had never married, but was far from alone, surrounded by a chosen family of those who had found healing in the sanctuary and remained connected to its ongoing evolution, together with the descendants of Rusty, now the 5th generation, who maintained the canine guardianship that had helped save a desperate boy decades earlier. On this anniversary morning, as Marcus walked familiar paths through gardens now mature and self-sustaining, past stone walls that stood solid yet softened by decades of careful integration with living plants, he paused beside the altar pond where visitors had begun the tradition of floating candles for their own healing journeys, each light reflecting the essential truth of the sanctuary, Immentus, that abandonment need not define a life, that broken places might become the most sacred, and that paradise was not a perfect garden from which humans had been cast out, but rather something that could be built with patient hands and resilient hearts from the ruins life provided. "Welcome home," Marcus whispered to a newly arrived teenager, standing hesitant at the sanctuary entrance, the same words Thomas had spoken to him years ago, understanding that home was not the place one started from, but what one created. A truth embodied in this living paradise, where stone, nature, and healing spirit had found perfect harmony, and where the abandoned discovered that endings might become the most beautiful beginnings.